My name is Anna. I'm 42 years old, married for almost 20 years, with 2 children. On the surface, my life looks perfect, stable, orderly, and predictable. A house, a husband, children who are growing up, work that I enjoy in small doses, and routines that, for most people, would seem comforting. Yet beneath that surface, I felt an emptiness that crept in slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, and then more insistently over the years. The mornings were the same. My alarm would go off at 6, and I would wake up, groggy, rubbing my eyes, feeling the subtle weight of time pressing down on me. I'd get up, make coffee for my husband, pack lunches for the kids, and make sure everyone's morning ritual went smoothly. My husband, Michael, would leave for work with a quick kiss on the cheek, a "have a good day," and then disappear into the predictable routine of his office life. I stayed behind, tidying up, checking emails, organizing the house, running my small accounting business. The house was always neat. I prided myself on keeping it clean and welcoming. There was comfort in this, but also a sense of invisibility. No one noticed when I polished the floors or scrubbed the kitchen tiles. No one remarked on the way I ironed shirts or coordinated the colors in the living room. My life had become a set of motions, a choreography of responsibilities and expectations, and I sometimes wondered, had I become invisible, or was I just blending into the background so seamlessly that even I couldn't see myself anymore? The children brought joy, certainly. My son, James, was already in college, ambitious and independent. I admired him, yet even with pride, I sometimes felt the ache of distance. He was growing up, and his world no longer revolved around me. My daughter, Emily, was still in high school, full of energy, dreams, and questions. She needed me in a different way now, not the constant hands-on care of infancy, but guidance, advice, and emotional support. And I gave it all willingly. But in giving, I often forgot to notice myself. Evenings were the same rhythm. Michael would come home, tired from work. We would have dinner, discuss the kids, laugh at television shows, or sit in companionable silence. There were occasional moments of intimacy, but they felt more like duty than passion. I tried to convince myself that this was normal. 20 years of marriage, after all. Passion changes, it fades, and what remains is comfort, security, and companionship. Yet inside me, there was a longing, a quiet whisper that I tried to ignore. I noticed it when I looked in the mirror, searching for lines and wrinkles, thinking about how I appeared to others, not just my family. I thought about how much I had changed since I was 22, vibrant and full of curiosity about the world. Somewhere along the way, I had become practical, responsible, reliable, but also dull in ways I did not recognize at the time. I missed attention, not as a mother or a wife, but as a woman, a person who could still be noticed and desired. The turning point came slowly. It wasn't sudden, a lightning strike that shattered my life. It was more like a soft rustling, almost imperceptible at first. It started with small moments of noticing people in ways I hadn't before, how a man at the store smiled at me, or how a colleague's tone lingered just a little longer than necessary. I would feel a tiny spark of excitement, a rush of something new and forbidden, and then quickly scold myself for thinking such thoughts. I buried myself in work and family, as always. I tried to fill the gaps with routine, with tasks, with the security of familiarity. Yet the emptiness persisted. It whispered at me in quiet moments, in the pauses between responsibilities. And then I met Alexander. It was a tax seminar, a professional gathering of lawyers, accountants, and business people. He was 45, tall, confident, well-groomed. We met during a coffee break, introduced ourselves politely, exchanged business cards, and talked about tax law and legal regulations. At first, it was strictly professional, but something about him caught my attention. Perhaps it was the way he listened, really listened, or the subtle humor in his voice, or the way his eyes seemed to linger just a moment longer than necessary when he spoke to me. We exchanged a few emails after the seminar. Work-related topics at first, dry and professional. But soon, he began asking about my day, my interests, little things about my life. He commented on my writing style, the way I organized reports, and even on little details of my personality that I had forgotten I exhibited. Every message brought a subtle thrill, a spark of something alive that I had not felt in years. At first, I resisted. I told myself I was imagining things, that this was harmless, professional curiosity, and that I could easily ignore the feelings that were rising inside me. But the truth was, I was waiting for his messages. I found myself checking my phone compulsively, anticipating that small vibration or notification. I felt a rush of excitement I hadn't experienced in decades. I was, against all reason and prudence, alive in a way I had forgotten was possible. And then came the day I realized I could no longer ignore the possibility of something more. The line between admiration and desire blurred. It scared me, yes, but it also thrilled me. I felt emotions so intense that I had to hide them, as though letting them surface would shatter the fragile order of my life. I was careful, cautious, rational. Yet beneath the surface, a current of something irresistible began to pull me into uncharted waters. Even at home, life carried on in its predictable rhythm. Michael and I continued our routines. Children laughed, meals were cooked, laundry folded, bills paid. Yet, inside me, a secret world was forming, invisible to anyone but myself. It was a world of longing, of excitement, of dangerous curiosity. I knew, deep down, that once I crossed the boundary, there would be no turning back. And that boundary was approaching. After weeks of exchanging professional emails, the messages between Alexander and me began to take on a new tone. At first, it was subtle, a comment about my weekend plans, a joke about a tedious tax law amendment, a question about my favorite coffee. I brushed off the little flutter in my chest, telling myself it was harmless, that adults can have friendly conversations without consequences. But the truth was that every notification from him made my heart race. Every word carried an unexpected weight, as if he had entered a world inside me that had long been dormant. I remember the first time I really noticed him. It was a Thursday, gray and rainy, the kind of day that makes your mood heavy. I was scrolling through emails while waiting for the evening to arrive, feeling the familiar tug of loneliness that always followed a long day. And then there it was, a message from Alexander, not about work but asking about a book I had mentioned weeks ago. He remembered, he said, that I enjoyed historical novels. That small attention, that simple act of remembering, felt like sunlight breaking through the clouds. I realized I had been craving someone to notice me, not for my duties or achievements, but simply for who I was. Our messages became longer. We shared little things about our lives, anecdotes from childhood, memories of places we had traveled, dreams we had quietly harbored. I found myself laughing more than I had in months, smiling at my phone in ways that felt almost rebellious. My husband would ask me about my day, and I would answer automatically, hiding the vivid excitement that Alexander's words had stirred in me. I was living two lives simultaneously, one in the safety of my home, and one in a secret, thrilling world that existed only in texts and fleeting thoughts. The first time we met outside a professional setting, I felt my heart pound like never before. Alexander suggested we have coffee at a small cafe near his office. I told myself it was innocent, just coffee, just conversation. But when I saw him waiting, casually leaning against the wall, the reality of our growing connection hit me like a shockwave. He smiled, warm and genuine, and my breath caught. His presence was commanding yet comforting, a paradox I could not reconcile. We talked for hours. Not about work, but about life, about our hopes and disappointments, about the ordinary moments that somehow became extraordinary when shared with someone who truly listens. I noticed the way his eyes crinkled when he laughed, the subtle tilts of his head when he was curious, the gentle pauses that seemed to give weight to every word he spoke. I felt alive in a way I had not felt in years, my senses sharpened, every detail of the world around me more vivid. As the weeks passed, our meetings continued. Coffee became lunch, lunch became long walks, and those walks began to stretch late into the evening. Each encounter left me exhilarated, but also terrified. I knew I was treading dangerous territory. I knew that every smile, every glance, every brush of the hand was a step further into a world I had no right to enter. Yet I could not stop myself. The texts became more intimate. Alexander would ask about my day, not just as a formality, but with genuine interest. He noticed the subtle changes in my tone, my moods, my small expressions. He asked questions that made me pause and reflect, questions that had nothing to do with taxes or business, questions that reached into my heart. I felt seen in ways I had almost forgotten were possible. At home, I carried a growing tension. Michael remained the same, steadfast and reliable, unaware of the storm brewing within me. I loved him, yes, in a quiet, steady way. But love and desire are not always synonymous. I found myself longing for the stolen moments with Alexander, replaying his words, his laughter, his gaze. I felt guilty, yes, a gnawing guilt that followed me like a shadow, but it was mixed with an undeniable thrill that left me restless and awake at night. One evening, after a particularly long day, Alexander suggested I meet him for a walk in a nearby park. The air was cool and crisp, and the city lights reflected in puddles from an earlier rain. I hesitated, knowing I was stepping further into temptation, but the pull was irresistible. He greeted me with a gentle smile, and together we walked along the winding paths, speaking softly about nothing and everything at once. At some point, our hands brushed. It was fleeting, a casual touch, but it sent a jolt through me. My mind raced. My body responded instinctively, and I felt the exhilarating terror of crossing a boundary I had always promised myself I would never approach. We stopped by a fountain, and for a moment, the world seemed to shrink to just the two of us. I could feel my heart in my throat, and I realized that I was standing at the edge of a precipice, aware that once I took the next step, nothing would be the same. It was in these moments that I truly understood the complexity of desire. It is not just physical attraction or fleeting passion. It is recognition, attention, connection, and the intoxicating idea of being understood completely by another human being. Alexander provided that in a way that my life, my marriage, and even I myself had not offered for years. And with that understanding came both exhilaration and terror. Returning home that night, I felt the familiar duality, the comfort of family, the warmth of home, and the thrill of secrecy, mingled with guilt and fear. I knew that what I was experiencing was dangerous, that I was playing with fire, yet the pull was irresistible. It was as if a part of me that had been dormant for decades had awakened, demanding attention, craving experience, and refusing to be ignored. And so began a new chapter in my life, a chapter filled with secrecy, excitement, and peril. Each message, each meeting, each glance carried the weight of potential destruction, yet I could not resist. The line between right and wrong blurred, and I found myself navigating an emotional labyrinth with no clear exit. I was alive. Yes, but at what cost? The weeks that followed were a delicate balancing act, a dance on a knife's edge. Every morning, I returned to my family, my routine, my obligations, pretending that nothing had changed. I would kiss my children, ask about their day, and smile at Michael, who still carried the same quiet warmth and patience that had drawn me to him all those years ago. And yet, beneath the surface, a storm raged. Alexander became a constant presence in my mind. Each message from him was like a spark in dry grass, igniting feelings I hadn't felt in decades. When we met, it was no longer just coffee or walks. Our encounters grew more intimate. A brush of the hand lingered longer, a glance held deeper meaning, and one evening, in the quiet of an empty park after sunset, he kissed me again. This time, I didn't pull away. That first kiss was nothing like the cautious, experimental contact of our earlier meetings. It was urgent, electric, and it sent a shiver through every nerve in my body. I felt my heart racing, my breath shallow, and a mixture of exhilaration and terror that I could neither ignore nor control. I knew, in that instant, that I was crossing a line from which there would be no return. And yet I wanted it. Wanted him. Wanted to feel alive in a way I hadn't in years. Returning home afterward was always the hardest part. I would walk through the door, slip off my coat, and be greeted by the familiar smells of home, the laughter of my children, Michael's steady presence. I would hug my kids, chat with Michael, and do my best to appear as the devoted mother and wife I had always been. But every word, every touch, every mundane interaction carried a shadow, a weight that only I could feel. I began to notice changes in myself. I dressed more carefully, applied lipstick even when I had no reason to leave the house, and carried myself with a confidence I hadn't felt in years. Inside, I was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions, desire and guilt, excitement and fear, love and betrayal. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself that my family life was safe, that nothing would ever change, but deep down, I knew that I was living on borrowed time. Our secret meetings became increasingly daring. Lunch breaks, evening walks, late-night texts when I should have been asleep. Each encounter heightened the thrill and the danger. Alexander had a way of making me feel seen, appreciated, and alive, as though the world had suddenly gained color after years of gray. He listened, he laughed, he touched, he noticed the subtle things that no one else seemed to. I craved his attention, yet each craving came with a sting of guilt that never left me. I started to keep small notes, reminders of our meetings, little things he said that resonated deeply. I would read them late at night, hidden under the blankets, trying to capture and preserve the moments that made me feel alive. And each time, the guilt returned, gnawing at my conscience, whispering that I was betraying everything I had promised myself and my family. One night, after a long day, Alexander invited me to his apartment. It was the first time I went beyond public spaces into a private, intimate setting. The apartment was warm, tastefully decorated, and smelled faintly of coffee and books. We sat close on the sofa, and the conversation flowed effortlessly. And then, as if the universe had agreed to condense all our suppressed desires into one moment, our lips met. The kiss was long, lingering, and filled with the pent-up tension of weeks. I felt my body respond instinctively, a rush of heat and longing I hadn't experienced in years. My mind screamed with guilt, yet my heart raced uncontrollably. I knew I was crossing into territory I could never undo. And still, I surrendered to the sensation, to the desire, to the forbidden intimacy that made me feel alive. Returning home that night, the guilt was unbearable. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying every detail, every touch, every word. I loved my husband. I truly did. But the love I felt for Alexander was a different kind, a dangerous, intoxicating passion that both thrilled and terrified me. I realized then that the life I had carefully built, the marriage I had nurtured for decades, was now entwined with deception that could unravel everything in an instant. Yet, despite the guilt, I continued. I continued to meet Alexander, continued to text him late at night, continued to steal moments that belonged to no one but us. I felt trapped between two worlds, one of duty, stability, and family love, and another of desire, passion, and reckless abandon. And every day, every choice, made the line between the two worlds blur further, until I wasn't sure which life belonged to me, and which belonged to the lie I was living. The paradox of secrecy is that it feeds both excitement and fear. I would laugh with Alexander, feel the warmth of his hands on mine, and yet, simultaneously, feel a tightening in my chest, knowing that Michael's trust, my children's innocence, and everything I had built could collapse in an instant. The thrill of being desired, of feeling alive, was intertwined with a constant, gnawing guilt that no smile, no touch, no whispered word could ever erase. I began to understand the cost of infidelity, not just the potential loss of family and trust, but the slow erosion of my own peace of mind. I carried two lives inside me, one bright and exhilarating, the other steady and familiar. And the more I indulged in the first, the more the second felt both comforting and suffocating. I was caught in a delicate, painful tension, unable to fully embrace either life, and unable to abandon one without destroying the other. By now, The secret had become a part of me. It was a weight I carried quietly, an invisible chain that bound me to choices I had never imagined making. Each meeting with Alexander left me trembling with excitement and dread, each text a spark in a powder keg of emotions. I knew I was walking a fine line, that one misstep could shatter everything. And yet, the pull of desire, the intoxication of being truly seen, was irresistible. And so, life continued. On the surface, the same as always, routine and predictable, filled with family dinners, school events, and the comforting hum of domestic life. Beneath the surface, however, a different reality thrived, one of secret glances, hidden messages, stolen kisses, and the ever-present, aching guilt that reminded me that no pleasure comes without a price. It happened on an ordinary evening. I had returned from a meeting with Alexander, my heart still racing from our stolen time together. The house was quiet, Michael sitting in the living room reading, the children asleep upstairs. I had barely set my bag down when I noticed his expression, something I had never seen before. He was silent at first, just staring, eyes sharp and unwavering. My stomach dropped. I knew immediately that something was wrong. The tension was palpable, almost suffocating, and I felt a cold wave of fear. Finally, he spoke, his voice low, controlled, but carrying a weight I could feel in every syllable. "Anna, I found the messages." My heart stopped. My mind raced, 1,000 excuses, 1,000 denials forming and collapsing before they could leave my lips. I couldn't lie, not this time. Not with the evidence in his hands. "Yes, that's true," I whispered, my voice barely audible, trembling. The room seemed to shrink. Silence followed, thick and suffocating. I watched him, the man I had loved and trusted for over 20 years, trying to process the betrayal, trying to understand how the life we had built together could unravel in a single evening. We talked for hours. Words flowed, sometimes painful, sometimes pleading, always honest. I explained everything, the emptiness I had felt, the attention I had craved, the connection with Alexander. I did not justify my actions. I admitted them, raw and unfiltered. Michael listened, eyes red, voice breaking at times, and yet, through the hurt, I saw glimpses of the man I had fallen in love with, the man capable of understanding, of empathy, of choosing to fight rather than flee. He asked questions, hard questions, questions I couldn't always answer, questions that made me confront the depth of my betrayal. I begged for forgiveness, knowing it might never come fully. I promised to end all contact with Alexander, to rebuild what I had broken, to devote myself to the marriage, to the family that had always been my anchor. It was not immediate. Trust, once shattered, cannot be repaired overnight. The following days were tense, filled with awkward silences, glances that spoke volumes, and the weight of unspoken thoughts. I watched Michael, waiting for signs that he might walk away, that the love we had nurtured for decades might be irretrievably lost. Yet, slowly something shifted. We began to talk, really talk, about everything we had neglected, the quiet dissatisfaction, the lack of intimacy, the unspoken frustrations and unmet needs. It was painful, exposing raw nerves and deep-seated insecurities, but also liberating. For the first time in months, we were truly honest with each other. I realized then that infidelity, as destructive as it is, can sometimes act as a harsh mirror, reflecting the fractures and weaknesses we have long ignored. It forced us to confront our emotions, to speak truths we had buried under years of routine and familiarity. I cut off all contact with Alexander immediately. The messages stopped, the meeting ceased, the temptation was gone. And yet, the memory remained, a lingering shadow of what could have been, a reminder of the fragile line between desire and duty. Rebuilding trust was slow, a painstaking process of small gestures, consistent honesty, and patient forgiveness. Michael began to show signs of warmth, attentiveness, and care that I had not seen in years. I, in turn, made conscious efforts to communicate, to share my feelings, to appreciate the life we had together rather than longing for what I had briefly stolen from it. The children, oblivious to the intricacies of adult relationships, continued their lives, but I could not escape the shadow of my actions. I carried it quietly, a scar that reminded me daily of the pain I had caused, the trust one had breached, and the fragile nature of love. And yet, there was hope. There was a fragile, delicate hope that the love we had cultivated for decades could survive, that honesty, communication, and effort could mend what had been broken. The road ahead was long, but for the first time in months, I felt that we might walk it together. Infidelity, I realized, is not a path to happiness. It is a storm that leaves devastation in its wake. But if one chooses to confront the consequences, to face the pain and the guilt, there is a possibility, not certainty, but possibility, of renewal, understanding, and growth. Life after betrayal is never the same. The memory lingers, the lessons remain, and the scars remind us of both our capacity for error and our capacity for forgiveness. We are changed, yes, but in those changes, there is also the chance to rebuild, to reconnect, and to cherish the fragile, beautiful complexity of human relationships. Months passed. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the storm that had engulfed our lives began to settle. The tension in our home softened. The silence that once weighed on my chest became easier to breathe. Michael and I had not returned to exactly the same marriage as before, but perhaps that was impossible. Instead, we were building something different, something more honest, more aware, and, surprisingly, more resilient. I spent a lot of time reflecting on my actions. Infidelity had been a reckless escape, a search for attention and validation that I had not asked from the person closest to me. But in its wake, it forced me to examine the deeper currents of my life, the desires, insecurities, and fears that I had long ignored. I began journaling again, something I had abandoned years ago, pouring my thoughts onto the page, confronting my guilt, and trying to understand the woman I had become. Michael, too, was changed. The hurt did not disappear, but he made a conscious choice to stay, to engage, to rebuild trust piece by piece. He became more attentive, noticing little things I had taken for granted, how I liked my tea, which book I wanted next, the way I sighed after a long day. It was not perfect. There were moments of tension, glances heavy with unspoken memories, and conversations that reopened old wounds. But through them, we found understanding. We started to reconnect in ways that had been missing for years. Date nights returned, small at first, then more adventurous. We laughed again, not the mechanical laughter of comfort, but genuine, unguarded laughter. We shared our fears, our dreams, our quiet disappointments. The marriage that had been on autopilot awakened, slowly but deliberately, as if learning to breathe again after suffocating under years of routine. I also learned to forgive myself, not entirely, for some mistakes are indelible, but enough to live without constant self-condemnation. The guilt, though persistent, became a reminder, a guidepost pointing toward the values I wished to uphold: honesty, presence, and respect. I embraced my identity not only as a wife and mother, but as a woman deserving of attention and care, without seeking it in ways that could destroy what I held dear. Alexander faded into memory. His presence, once electric and consuming, was now a distant echo. The thrill he brought was real, yes, but it was fleeting and ultimately hollow compared to the depth of a lifelong partnership. I did not seek him out. I did not crave him. Instead, I learned to channel my energy into nurturing the bonds that mattered. The family I loved, the marriage I had risked, the friendships and connections that sustained me. Life continued, in all its imperfect, beautiful complexity. The children grew, unaware of the emotional storms that had passed, but thriving in the security of home. My relationship with Michael matured. We had learned that love is not just passion or comfort, but a daily choice, a commitment to listen, to forgive, and to fight for each other even when it is hard. And there were moments, unexpected, fleeting, when I caught myself smiling at him across the room, feeling that old spark of desire intertwined with gratitude. I realized then that intimacy is not destroyed by mistakes. It can be reshaped, deepened, and made stronger by honesty and effort. The experience taught me more than I expected. I learned that love is fragile, but not fragile enough to break entirely if tended with care. I learned that trust, once fractured, demands patience, transparency, and humility to heal. I learned that desire, longing, and attention must be nurtured within the framework of commitment, lest they become dangerous distractions. And most importantly, I learned that life, even after betrayal, carries the possibility of redemption. It is never easy, never guaranteed, but it exists for those willing to face the pain, confront the mistakes, and rebuild with conscious intent. I am Anna. I am flawed, human, and deeply aware of my choices. I have made mistakes, but I have also learned from them. I remain married, perhaps changed forever, but with a marriage renewed by honesty, reflection, and shared effort. The scars remain, yes, but they are not just marks of pain. They are reminders of growth, resilience, and the enduring power of love when nurtured with care. Life moves on, and I, at last, feel that I am moving with it, wiser, more grounded, and determined never to let the quiet complacency of years blind me again to the care, attention, and connection that love demands.